Merhabalar sevgili izleyenler. Dünya haftalardır Amerika, İsrail ve İran hattında tırmanan gerilime kilitlenmiş durumda. Bölgedeki gelişmeler yalnızca bugünü değil, tarihi ve küresel dengelerin merkezi konularını da gündeme getiriyor. Tam bu soruların izini sürdüğümüz bir dönemde dünyanın merkezi Basra Körfezi'nin küresel tarihi kitabının yazarı Allen Fromherz'le Orta Doğu'nun neden hala dünyanın kalbi sayıldığını ve tüm bu yaşananların tarihsel arka planını konuşacağız. Öncelikle hepinize hoş geldiniz diyorum. So everyone has been talking about the tweets by US President Donald Trump, which was posted 2 days ago. In which he said, "Open the damn Strait of Hürmüz already, you crazy people, and if you don't, just watch what happens." The US and Israel have launched a war against Iran for entirely different underlying reasons, yet the issue quickly became fixated on the Strait of Hürmüz. What do you think makes the Persian Gulf and specifically the Strait of Hürmüz so uniquely important to our world? And, there are many straits in the world. So why do global crises consistently converge on Hormuz? In your book, you describe it as the heart of the global trade. Why do you think has this made it an indispensable hunting ground for great powers throughout the history, from Portuguese and the British to the United States and the current situation today?
Thank you so much. Excellent question. The Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf as a whole is at the center of the world. That's the title of my book. And I make that argument as something that has been true not just recently, but over the long-term history, really, of humanity. Because history traditionally has been when the first records were written down. That's the distinction between prehistory and history. History is when you have written language. And the first written languages that we know of course, came from Mesopotamia. So even in the very earliest 2000 BC, 3000 BC, we have this interesting account of the Gulf as this place where world trade really first started. Right? The first civilizational exchanges between the Indus River Valley and Mesopotamia happened through the Strait of Hormuz, right? And you have a sense of the Gulf being a very different place, a place that is very hard to control by any one empire, by any one regime. And we're finding that even being proved the case today, even with potentially the world's most powerful military in history, which is the United States, facing the realities of trying to control this geographically extremely difficult part of the world, but extremely strategic at the same time. So the geography, interestingly, it prevents centralized powers from controlling it, but it's also extremely useful to those very centralized powers and empires. So that's why the Gulf is is this inflection point, is this strategically central place throughout world history.
In your book, you refer to the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz as the center of the world. Today, US aircraft carriers are stationed there, and Iranian drones are filling the skies. Looking at history, is the region destined to remain a perpetual conflict zone? And what similarities can we draw between ancient power struggles and today's US-Iran tensions?
I don't think it's destined to be a conflict zone. In fact, we just need to look into recent history when it was a place of great, or it still is a place of great prosperity for those parts of the Gulf that are engaged in the international community more fully. I think there is potential if Iran and the United States come to some sort of compromise, or Iran can establish a way of living with the United States and its allies more effectively, and vice versa, that potentially finding someone that Trump can work with, and the Gulf Arab states as well, that we could see the Gulf having a return to kind of its golden age. It has these periods when relative stability has allowed the Gulf to prosper even beyond its usual level of importance commercially. And I think there's definitely a potential to return to that. If it doesn't over the long term, though, there's some interesting things that could happen. I mean, there's been talk of cutting a channel through the Musandam Peninsula. There's a very narrow part of the Musandam which would allow ships that are closer to move closer to the Omani coast there. Omanis have been a very important part of this because they've maintained a level of neutrality greater than even some of the other Gulf states like that have been seeing more attacks, like Qatar and the UAE, et cetera. Also, I think if it continues to move forward, there might be even attempts to circumvent the geography further. There's already pipelines that go across Arabia or that go down into Oman. I would expect there would be even more of that being built, especially for the natural gas coming out of places like Qatar. Qatar has been, despite the fact that Qatar has often been portrayed as somewhat closer to Iran or able to talk to Iran because the Iranians helped the Qataris during their blockade, Qatar has been the most cut off by this, by the shutting down of the Strait of Hormuz, by just the threat that the Iranians are using. I think the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf today also show the power of asymmetric warfare when you have this particular geography, right? It's when you have these mountainous terrains coming right up to strategic waterways, that allows an extreme advantage to those who can maintain power over those or allegiances over those mountainous regions. So we'll see, because in some ways the center of power within Iran has always been further inland, right? Has been in the uplands and upper plateaus of Iran. And some have even suggested, well, why haven't the United States and its allies kind of pursued, for example, the Kurds or even the Ahwaz, the Arab nationalists who are along the coasts, kind of, and the Baluchis? Why haven't they encouraged that? I think the reason is they don't want to deal with kind of the chaotic consequences of all those nationalisms potentially pursuing their own objectives outside of the ultimate stability of the area. But I think that is why the United States hasn't necessarily gone in. It would take a huge amount of effort, some say 100,000 troops, to actually secure those mountainous areas around the Strait of Hormuz and along the entire Persian Gulf coast, because it's not just the Strait of Hormuz that's relatively narrow, it's also along the rest of the coast as well, all the way up to all the islands that Iran controls. So I think, yes, I think it again proves this interesting situation where you have relatively small numbers of people who can survive along the Persian Gulf coast being able to extract concessions from much more powerful, larger empires.
Mm-hmm. And do you really think the possibility of a new channel is realistic?
Well, during the British period, right, when the British were in a partnership with Oman, it wasn't the same as the protectorate as other parts of the Gulf. There were explorations of this idea, and there were actually some feasibility studies being done. I think we only would move in that direction if this conflict is still going on 5 years, 10 years from now. I think the expectation is that something is going to shift at some point or the other. I don't think it's sustainable to have a situation where Iran is extracting tolls from the international community. I don't think that would be something that any power would necessarily want to maintain. I do know that Turkey was able to negotiate a situation to allow some of its ships out. Also Malaysia. There might be some deals happening that we don't know behind the news, but I don't think that even Turkey or even Malaysia or Pakistan would want to be beholden entirely to the whims of the Iranian government when it comes to passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Yeah.
So from this point, let's move to history. Today, some interpret Iran's actions as expansionism. From the historical perspective you also present in your book, do you think could Iran's resistance in the Gulf actually be understood as a long-standing survival reflex shaped by centuries of foreign interventions, for example, from Portuguese to the British, and maybe today with the American?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Iran is a very interesting sort of imperial case study, because if you look at the history of empires more broadly, most of the successful empires, at least when you look at a perspective from Western history especially, the main argument for a successful empire, especially from the 16th century onward, is that they must have a good navy. Without a good navy, sure, you might have expansive control over some large tract of land around your capital and other regions and so on, around certain land trade routes. But if you can't control a navy that can project power over large distances, and if you can't control your own waterways and coastline, you are inevitably going to be subject to other imperial powers. And that's precisely what happened to Iran. And that explains why Iran, although in the very earliest period, in truly ancient history, right, before you had sea-going, ocean-going craft that were very effective, Iran was able to project its power under Cyrus the Great and all these traditional powers. But then you see the rise of these imperial navies that Iran, for some reason, never took hold, and is still a source of weakness for Iran to this day, because its navy has been easily disabled, destroyed by the U.S. Navy. It has no effective way of responding. So it's using this kind of asymmetric warfare and drones and so on, but that's not actually an effective way of projecting your power. What's interesting is that Iran has known this weakness for centuries, even millennia, and has tried to fix it, but has never been successful at doing so. And I think part of that is, again, because the central power within Iran is in the upper plateau, is in the central regions of Iran. And it hasn't ever been able to fully take advantage of the potential of direct control over its strategic ports. And even today, as I mentioned earlier, the ports along the Iranian shore, although, yes, they are part of the territorial integrity of the nation, of the Republic of Iran, they're oftentimes, the population is not fully or predominantly Persian. It's Arab, it's Baluchi, it's people who are not automatically necessarily beholden to the system or to the patronage of the government. So, yes, I think Iran is in a very interesting situation where the historical realities of its sort of structural weaknesses in terms of naval power are being revealed.
If we compare Britain's 19th century presence in the region under the banner of anti-piracy with today's US presence under the justification of freedom of navigation, has anything truly changed beyond terminology? And do you think if the West is genuinely protecting the Gulf or seeking to control it?
That's an interesting question. I think the Gulf is a means to a larger end when it comes to, especially the United States and the so-called West, right? Because the main aim for Trump, at least, is to open up the Strait of Hormuz by any means. He's not wanting, although he's mentioned it, taking over the Strait of Hormuz and himself charging a toll. I doubt that will happen. You never know. I think his main objective is, of course, and his Treasury Secretary and other advisors are telling him that they need to bring down the global price of oil, right? And so they realize they need to open up that strait for that reason. It's not going to be as direct of an impact on the United States, of course, because as Trump himself has mentioned, we have a lot of oil coming out of the United States now, and the type of crude that is processed by U.S. refineries is different than the crude that comes out of the Gulf. Be that as it may, I don't see even Trump probably, with Trump you can never predict, but seeing it as in the interests of the United States to actually outright control the Gulf. It's much better to be seen as maintaining a status quo that is in the interests of the majority of the world community and the world and global economy. And that was the position that the United States really laid out with the so-called Carter Doctrine, which developed about 10 years after the British withdrawal, right? So in 1979, of course, you had the Iranian Revolution and everything else, but you also had the main concern for all of the powerful people in the United States was the USSR, was the Soviets, which had not yet fallen, right? So their main concern was containing the Soviet Union and preventing the Soviet Union from coming down and potentially controlling all of that oil, which is in the Middle East and along the Gulf. So that Carter Doctrine says that the United States must maintain the free flow of commerce within the Strait of Hormuz. And that same doctrine has not shifted since then. That's why Trump has found himself in this bit of a trap and is so explicitly reacting to what was a very predictable strategy by the Iranians.
Drawing from the title of your book, if the Strait of Hormuz was to be completely closed today, whether by Iran or another power, would the global system truly collapse when the center of the world stops functioning? Has there ever been a comparable disruption in history?
The difference today is that we have insurance. They didn't have insurance at the same. They had different types of insurance. Actually, even in the medieval period, there's even some evidence that in the ancient period there was a type of insurance that happened. But yes,
I didn't know.
Yes, it's true. Yeah. Well, Venice, of course, is famous for this, where you would pay a certain amount just to protect your cargo because of the. But the insurance system today is so structurally against any potential risk, right? Especially risk that involves potential mortality, that we are not within, let's say, an economic environment where even the threat of piracy or the threat of potential attack or terrorism at a constant can be tolerated by the international insurance market today. So that what the United States is probably trying to create and has mentioned previously is a new form of insurance, right? Where the United States government basically backs up these companies to allow them to send their ships through. Even that, though, you have to have people who are willing to get on these ships and risk their lives simply to get oil to South Korea or to China. And are you going to find the mariners willing to do this? At some point, you're going to have to create some sort of international merchant marine or something like this. And this becomes very complicated, and it requires a great deal of change of the entire international system. So in a sense, yes, the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz has so disrupted the international commercial system, which is based on this assumption of insurance and liability, that it has blown a hole through the whole system. and made it impossible to function in terms of reacting to and adjusting to this new reality. Because what we're returning to is a pre-20th century, pre-World War II, pre-even British protectorate world, where you have the ability of asymmetric actors. And it may not even be the Iranian government directly. It could be people working on behalf of the Iranian government, like the Houthis over in the Bab el-Mandeb on the other side of Arabia, or other groups that we don't even know about yet that the Iranians can be arranging to disrupt this commerce. And then they can say, oh, well, plausible deniability, we weren't actually, that they did that on their own, right? So even if there's a situation where Iran agrees somehow to a new regime, that won't fully secure it. So yes, it has disrupted the entire international commercial system, which is based on this assumption of the limits of liability and the limit of risk. So in that sense, yes, it is really a historical major shift that has happened.
So continuing from the perspective of trade and merchants, I'd like to ask about the traces of historical evolution of the Gulf, of the Emirates and the tribal structures. Today, countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar are trying to restore the balance between US, Iran, and Israel. Could their diplomatic agility and their merchant intelligence, if you may call it like that, be rooted in the legacy of ancient port cities that you describe in the book?
Oh, definitely. Yes, the history of the merchant prince goes back way before the rise of oil. And what's, I think, one of the explanations, many scholars have assumed, in fact, that oil can be a curse, right? If you look at Venezuela, for example, it led to a very sclerotic, very dysfunctional government that has been easily taken over by the United States now. And other parts of the world where even Libya, for example, you have the oil causing more problems often than it actually solves. The Gulf disrupted that assumption. It says, actually, no, why are these Gulf Emirates and states doing so much better than other parts of the world? Why aren't they seemingly cursed by oil in the same way other parts of the world are? And the explanation actually is history. The explanation is what you prefaced this question with, that there have been a tradition of merchant princes who understand the value of free trade, going back and having that as part of their customary and cultural ethos, right? That it's not something imposed by the outside, it's something that comes from inside of their own culture, going back 5,000 years in many instances. Because if you look at the very first ports, if you look at the medieval ports, if you look at the early modern ports, they all have this almost competitive drive to be the most free and open port within the Persian Gulf. Because if you get that reputation, the merchants want to go to you first, right? Especially when it took, a whole year or 6 months. It took 6 months to get to where you wanted to go in India, and then another 6 months to get to China, and then come all the way back using the monsoon. Where were you going to stay for the months while you waited for the winds to change within the Gulf? You wanted to stay in the place that was the most tolerant of your religion, that was going to allow you to practice what you believe, the place that wasn't going to overtax you, that wasn't going to take your ship and hold it hostage or kidnap it. So the princes would compete with one another to be that port or that place where these ships wanted to go. And in the years before oil, you had pearls as the main commodity that was being traded, especially by the Arabian princes, because they had all these fantastically productive pearl banks that are still actually there. and being harvested occasionally. That's a very proud part of the heritage of places like Bahrain, for example, and other parts of the Gulf too. That was also and still is a worldwide global commodity, right? It's a very different commodity from oil. It's a luxury commodity, but it was still a major source of revenue for these Gulf princes. And it goes all the way back even to the medieval time. You see pearl fishers in 13th century maps from Barcelona, because they know it has such an incredible reputation that even as far away as Spain, they knew of the source of the biggest, most beautiful pearls came from the Gulf. So a merchant ethos, as opposed to an agricultural prince, has been a big advantage within the Gulf. In other parts of the world, most of the economy, 90% of your economy is coming before the modern period, comes from agriculture. It comes from how well you exploit the land and exploit the workers on the land, right? So if you look at the Ottoman Empire, even if you look at they have the iqtas, and they have the agricultural lords and systems and the whole stratigraphy of ways of getting that agricultural surplus up to the palace and up to the sultan, even in Anatolia itself. The main focus has not traditionally been on commerce. Commerce has been just sort of an extra that allows a little bit more revenue. In the Gulf, it is the main source of revenue, the customs house for the ruler, right? So they have a very different interest in terms of actually supporting and encouraging commerce from the rest of the world, and even having de facto toleration of other faiths, other systems, in order to encourage people to come. In agricultural economies, it's much less so. You want to control your population. You want to have almost uniform or somewhat uniform ideology and religious system that can make sure that people maintain your agricultural surplus. So, just speaking in purely economic terms, right? So the Gulf is really trained in what has become the global system, right? Today, that system of commerce and exchange and services taking over the economy is a very recent phenomenon, but it's a very ancient phenomenon for the Gulf, right? So, yes, this is a really interesting aspect, I think, of Khaliji or Gulf history.
Yeah, it's quite interesting how professions actually shape a geography. And if you may, we may talk about the effect of religion in this geography. So the US and Iran conflict is often framed along as a Sunni and Shia divide. However, your book highlights the region's historically multicultural and trade-oriented character. Do you think if the current conflict is truly a religious war, or is religion being used as a mask in a much larger struggle over economic power?
Yes, as is usually the case. And especially when you talk about these sort of sectarian conflicts, right? Because you're just recently, of course, Iran and Saudi Arabia signed a treaty with one another, and they exchanged ambassadors again. It was only a decade ago that Mohammed bin Salman was calling Iran an existential threat that needs to be destroyed. But then there was a change of tone. I think, especially after after Barack Obama's JCP, the joint the Iran nuclear accords, to form some sort of rapprochement with Iran on the Sunni Arab side, right? And especially, as I mentioned, Qatar, because Qatar is especially vulnerable and shares the natural gas field, the South Pars and the North Field, which is the main source for trillions of dollars worth of liquid natural gas that Qatar tries to export through the Strait of Hormuz, or will potentially try to export. Right now, it's just billions per year, but still. I think that, yes, I think the issue of religion, it can be called upon when it's strategically advantageous, but for the most part, most of the rulers of the Gulf itself, I'm not talking about the imperial centers, have seen an advantage in actually being less religiously dogmatic. And I think that will continue as long as there's autonomous states along the Gulf itself. Yeah. And you even see that, of course, in the history of, say, the UAE, which unfortunately now there's been, as a reaction to this war in the UAE, there's more restrictions being placed on Iranians who have lived in the UAE now for decades and their families, right? That even restrictions on travel and so on. So the Iranian community and the Iranians themselves are extremely diverse as well. Has been a vital part of the history of the Arabian side of the Gulf, and Arabs have also been a vital part of the history of the Iranian side of the Gulf, right? And one thing I hope that this war won't do is to divide that even further. So we'll see. It all depends on how long this conflict lasts, right? So,
throughout the history, these waters have hosted and outlasted the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British. Based on your research, do you think if United States currently is in a phase of withdrawal from the region, or are they moving toward a more assertive presence? Do you see the emergence of a new imperial power, perhaps China, on the horizon?
China's lack of reaction to the current instability, if anything, I think it reveals that China is still, in many respects, wanting to take advantage of the security blanket that the United States provides internationally. Because if the way that China would actually strategically be able to threaten the United States effectively is if it actually was a strategic alternative to the United States. But it's not presenting itself in that way, right? If it were fully in league, it doesn't want to be, even though it's presenting itself as a friend of Iran, it's not as close of an ally to Iran as the United States is with Britain or even with France. So, France and the United States have always had interest. It's not that close of a relationship. And I think that is revealing the nature of the Chinese is to see their international engagements almost purely in terms of investments that benefit them ultimately, right? And not in terms of making a strategic investment in terms of military power that would benefit the rest of the world community and them at the same time. So the United States is still ultimately the last option available, right? China is not a viable option. Because it hasn't come forth, it hasn't sent its navy, and it wouldn't send its navy. And what would it? It doesn't have the established bases or relationships in the region already, and I don't think that China would ever want to provoke the United States either in that region. If it's going to provoke the United States, it's going to provoke the United States in the Taiwan Straits. It's not going to provoke it in the Straits of Hormuz. So China is not an alternative. So ultimately, yes, we are in a situation where you have the United States as the only alternative, but you have the United States at least on one side of its mouth saying it wants to withdraw, but on the other saying it wants to ramp up its strategic investment going forward. I think what Trump is saying is really he's being serious about wanting to withdraw, but almost too serious in that he has provoked that this conflict has happened because of the desire to withdraw. But the United States has felt stuck there ever since the British themselves withdrew. And he thought that if the regime would just quickly fall in Iran, then we could withdraw and allow the region itself to maintain that security as opposed to the United States. What he miscalculated is that the regime is not going to be nearly as easy as Venezuela or other countries, and that the regime has used systems of oppression to keep its people from an uprising that was expected. Because I do think that they really did expect, and if you read some of the rhetoric that's been used and some of the ways that Trump has tried to talk to the Iranian people and even the Israelis too, how that surprising idea that there are Iranians calling the Israeli military and telling them where the leadership of the Iranian military is and the Iranian state, that they expected some sort of big uprising to happen, but it hasn't, right? And then from that, the United States could have eventually withdrawn if they found someone they could work with, and then focus on China. But that's not what's happening. So the United States is going to stay the strategic last resort, as much as the United States may be not always diplomatically as sensitive these days as it has been in the past.
It's really an enigma of foreign and domestic relationships.
Right.
Thank you so much for your great answers. So, if you like, we can move on to our last one.
Sure.
Finally, do you think the United States and Iran can reach an agreement? And if they do, what do you think it would mean for the future of the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf?
Oh, I mean, it would be amazing if they could reach it. But I think for the United States and Iran, in the current system in Iran, to reach an agreement, you would basically have to have someone like Adelcy Rodriguez. Adelcy Rodriguez is the vice president of Maduro, in Venezuela, who's basically made an agreement with the Trump administration. If you don't completely overthrow us, if you allow our regime to continue to exist, we will completely change our strategic orientation and our resources will be directed towards the United States and not to China and not to Iran and Russia. Because behind the curtains here, behind all this, Iran versus Ukraine, where we're focusing, behind even the talk about NATO or everything else, what's interesting is that this is part of a global conflict, that it is about Russia as well as Iran. It is about China as well. Even though I just talked about how China is strategically impossible for it to be as involved, it is still a part of, they would prefer a situation where the United States is not successful. And they prefer a situation of dragging out this conflict as much as possible because they know as soon as the United States is able to pacify Iran, it's going to send its focus towards Taiwan. It's going to send even potentially, especially after Trump is done with this, when you get an American president who doesn't have a relationship with Putin, it's going to probably lead to a victory within Ukraine for the West. So they want to delay that as much as possible, right? But what the United States, at least in the Trump administration's new sort of strategy, is actually something taken from Cyrus the Great from Persia. Ancient Persia was expert at this. You take out the top leader of the country or nation or area, region that you want to overthrow. You take out, the top ones who are recalcitrant, and you put in your satrap, or the one that will work with you. And beyond that, you don't worry. You just let them make sure they keep the taxes and the lights on, that they, and then you're not having to send your entire army to occupy a place and take over and be responsible for the government. So if eventually someone could emerge who sees it more in their interest to work with the United States than to continue this kind of march towards martyrdom, which is seemingly where it's going now, march towards death, then yes, I think there could be some sort of agreement that comes about. Well, that would be a positive development, inevitably. I think a ceasefire of any sort would be good, and a new understanding. If it's successful, if it's just moderately successful, or how successful it is, will all be the determinants of whether this will be a positive outcome for the region and for the rest of the world.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yes.
Sevgili izleyenler, bugün Dünyanın Merkezi kitabının yazarı Allen Fromherz ile birlikteydik. İran, ABD, Hürmüz Boğazı ve Orta Doğu'nun geleceği gibi konuları tarihsel bir perspektiften bakarak değerlendirdik. Hepinize iyi seyirler diliyorum. Sonraki programımızda görüşmek üzere.